The cold was a constant companion. It was a thief that stole the warmth from her fingers and the feeling from her toes. It lived in the thin wool of her tunic and the damp stone of the scullery floor. Alara pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, trying to force back the exhaustion that was a second skin. The water in the bucket had long since turned to a greasy, frigid gray, and the floor was no cleaner than when she had started, hours ago. She was a ghost in this pack house, an omega, less than nothing, a shadow that scurried along the walls to avoid being seen, to avoid being struck. Her parents, exiles from a distant northern pack, had died in a rogue attack years ago, leaving her a ward of the Blackwood pack, a burden. Alpha Valerius had made that clear from the very beginning. She was to earn her keep, and her keep was a cold corner in the servants' quarters and whatever scraps were left after the pack had eaten. Her stomach twisted with a familiar, hollow ache. She had not eaten today, or yesterday. The hunger was just another part of the cold, another part of the pain that defined her existence. She dipped the rough cloth back into the bucket, the icy water a shock that jolted up her arms. Her hands were raw, the knuckles split and bleeding in a dozen places. She gritted her teeth against the sting. Pain was a reminder she was still alive, even if she did not feel like it. A sharp kick to her side sent her sprawling. The bucket tipped, spilling its foul contents across the flagstone she had just scrubbed. A gasp of pain and surprise was stolen from her lungs. She looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Lyra stood over her, the Alpha's daughter, her face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Two of her friends flanked her, their lips curled in identical sneers. Lyra was everything Alara was not. She was beautiful, with hair like spun gold and eyes the color of a summer sky. She was strong, confident, and adored, and she hated Alara with a passion that burned cold. "Look at it," Lyra said, her voice dripping with contempt. "The worthless Omega, making more of a mess. Can you do nothing right?" Alara scrambled to her knees, ignoring the fresh wave of pain from her ribs. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up." Her voice was a whisper, thin and reedy. She hated how weak she sounded. Lyra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You'll clean it up?" "Of course you will. It's all you're good for. You're a stain on this pack, Alara. A blight. My father only lets you stay out of pity. You should be grateful we don't just cast you out into the snow to starve." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, striking the most vulnerable parts of her. She knew it was true. She was worthless, unwanted, a ghost that breathed. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the spreading puddle of dirty water. If she did not look at them, maybe they would disappear. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Lyra snapped. "Don't you ever look at me like that again," Lyra hissed, her face inches from Alara's. "You are nothing. Remember that." With a final contemptuous shove, Lyra and her friends swept out of the room, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Alara slid down the wall until she was sitting in the cold, dirty water. The pain in her cheek was a hot brand, but it was nothing compared to the crushing weight in her soul. Nothing. She was nothing. The word echoed in the sudden silence. It was what she had been told her entire life. It was what she had come to believe. She wrapped her arms around her knees, shivering, though the cold was no longer just in the air. It was inside her, a glacier in her heart. She had tried, gods, she had tried, to be invisible, to be useful, to not be a burden. But it was never enough. There was no place for her here. There was no place for her anywhere. The little spark of resilience that had kept her going for so long was finally, truly extinguished. All that was left was a deep, profound emptiness. An idea, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through the fog of her despair. It was a thought she had pushed away before, a dark whisper on the edge of her consciousness. But now, it was a clear, calm certainty. Lyra was right. She was a stain, and stains could be removed. Slowly, unsteadily, Alara got to her feet. She did not look at the spilled water or the dirty cloth. She walked out of the scullery, her movements stiff and robotic. She moved through the pack house, a ghost in truth now, unseen and unnoticed. She walked past the great hall where the scent of roasting meat and warm bread made her stomach cramp. She walked out the main doors, into the biting wind of the coming storm. The wind sliced like claws, tearing at her thin clothes, but she barely felt it. She had a destination, a purpose. The Widow's Leap, the highest cliff on the coastline, a sheer drop into the churning, ice-choked sea. They said it was where women whose mates had been lost at sea came to follow them, a place of finality, a place of peace. The walk was long. The snow began to fall, thick and heavy, blanketing the world in white. It clung to her eyelashes and melted on her bruised cheek. She did not feel the cold. She felt nothing at all. The emptiness inside her was a perfect void, a quiet peace she had never known. Finally, she reached the cliff's edge. The wind howled here, a mournful symphony. Below, the sea was a chaos of black water and grinding ice flows. The roar of it filled her ears, swallowing all other sound. It was a monster waiting to devour her, and she would let it. She took a deep breath, the frigid air burning her lungs. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not afraid. There was nothing left to be afraid of. She thought of Lyra's sneer, of Alpha Valerius's dismissive gaze, of the endless days of hunger and cold. She thought of being called worthless, a blight, nothing. And she decided it was enough. She closed her eyes and stepped off the edge of the world. There was no sensation of falling at first, just a sudden weightlessness, a silent surrender to gravity. The wind screamed past her ears. It was over. It would finally be over. A strange sense of relief washed through her. Then, something impossible happened. It was not the brutal, bone-shattering impact of the rocks she expected. It was not the lethal shock of the icy water. It was impact, yes, but it was solid and shockingly warm. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, arresting her fall with a jarring halt that knocked the breath from her lungs. Her eyes flew open. She was not falling. She was being held. Held against a chest so broad and hard it felt like a wall of granite. A huge, dark shape blotted out the swirling snow. something vast and powerful that had swooped from the heart of the storm itself. It was not a beast. It was a man. A man of impossible size, with wings, great leathery wings the color of midnight, that beat against the gale, holding them aloft against the cliff face. His face was all harsh angles and predatory beauty, framed by a mane of silver hair that whipped in the wind. And his eyes were the color of a winter storm, deep and churning gray, and they were fixed on her with a shocking intensity. Who was he? What was he? Her mind, numb with despair only moments before, reeled with confusion and a primal, heart-stopping fear. She was suspended between the sky and the sea, cradled in the arms of a terrifying stranger who had appeared from nowhere. He angled them away from the cliff, his powerful wings carrying them effortlessly toward a sheltered stone outcrop a little way down. He landed with a soft crunch of snow, his grip on her never lessening. He was real. The heat of his body soaked through her thin tunic, a stark contrast to the deathly chill that had permeated her bones. He smelled of pine and winter storms and something else, something ancient and wild. He set her on her feet but did not let her go. One large hand remained firmly on her arm, anchoring her in place. She stumbled, her legs weak and trembling. She could not look away from his face, from those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see right through her into the hollow, broken places inside. "What were you doing?" His voice was deep, a low rumble like distant thunder, and it vibrated through her entire body. It was not accusatory. It was a simple, raw question. Lyra could not answer. Her throat was tight, her mind a whirlwind. She had wanted to die. She had been dying, and this man, this creature, had caught her. Why? He seemed to read the question in her eyes. He took a step closer, his sheer size overwhelming. He reached out with his free hand, his movements slow, deliberate, as if approaching a frightened animal. She flinched as his fingers brushed against her cheek, the one Lyra had struck. His touch was not harsh. It was impossibly gentle, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The moment his skin met hers, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A blinding flash of white-hot light erupted behind her eyes. Searing heat flooded her veins, a fire that started where he touched her and spread through every cell of her being. It was agony and ecstasy, a terrifying, overwhelming torrent of power that felt like being struck by lightning. She cried out, a raw, strangled sound. A burning sensation, sharp and precise, bloomed on the skin of her collarbone, just below her neck. It felt as if a brand was being seared into her flesh. She tried to pull away, to escape the unbearable onslaught, but his grip was iron. Through the haze of pain and light, she saw his eyes change. The stormy gray bled away, replaced by a brilliant, molten gold that glowed with an inner fire. The light was so intense it seemed to pour from him, illuminating the swirling snow around them. The predator in his face softened, replaced by a look of stunned, absolute recognition. The burning on her skin subsided, leaving a tender, pulsing ache. The overwhelming flood of energy receded, leaving her gasping, trembling, her body feeling both ravaged and strangely, terrifyingly alive. He stared at her, his golden eyes wide with a kind of reverent awe. He looked from her face to the spot on her collarbone, now hidden by the collar of her tunic. He knew what was there. He had felt it form. "Mine," he breathed. The word was not a question or a declaration. It was a statement of fact, as absolute and undeniable as the storm raging around them. A claim. Alara stared back at him, her mind refusing to process what was happening. Pain, light, a burning mark, and that word. Mine. Fear, sharp and cold, cut through her confusion. This was not salvation. This was something else, something dangerous and unknown. Her instincts, honed by years of abuse, screamed at her to run, to hide. She tried to wrench her arm from his grasp, her panic lending her a sudden, desperate strength. "No," she whispered, the word ragged. "Let me go." His grip tightened, not painfully, but with an unyielding finality. His golden eyes held hers, and the sheer force of his will was a physical pressure. "Never," he said, his voice soft but resonant with power. "I have you. I've been waiting." Waiting? What did he mean, waiting? This was a nightmare. She had jumped from a cliff to escape a life of pain, only to be caught and claimed by a winged man with fire in his eyes. Her body, however, betrayed her. Against her will, a strange sense of rightness settled deep in her bones. The place where his hand held her arm tingled not with fear, but with a strange warmth. A part of her, a primal, instinctual part, recognized him. It felt the pull, the connection that had just been violently forged between them. Her mind screamed, "No!" but her soul whispered, "Yes." "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking. He watched her, his expression unreadable now, the molten gold of his eyes banking slightly, though still glowing. "I am Kaelin," he said, "and you are her." Her? The confusion was a dizzying wave. "I don't understand." "You will," he promised. He finally released her arm, only to shrug off the heavy, fur-lined cloak he wore. The sheer breadth of his shoulders and the corded muscle of his arms were intimidating. He wrapped the cloak around her, and she was instantly enveloped in his scent and a profound, life-giving warmth. It was thick and heavy, smelling of leather and pine and the man himself. It felt like a shield. "We need to get out of the storm," he said, his tone shifting, becoming practical, commanding. He gestured toward a narrow opening in the rock face she had not noticed before. "My camp is in there. It is safe." Alara clutched the heavy cloak around her, the warmth a sin she did not deserve but craved with a desperation that shamed her. She was too stunned to argue, too overwhelmed to do anything but obey. She followed him into the darkness of the cave. The howling of the wind faded, replaced by the crackle of a hidden fire. The cave was small but dry. A fire burned in a ring of stones, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Bedrolls and a few packs were arranged neatly. It was a temporary camp, but it was warmer and safer than any place she had ever called her own. Kaelin moved to the fire, adding a log from a small stack. The flames leaped up, illuminating his face. He was even more imposing up close. Scars, faint in silver, marked his skin, one bisecting an eyebrow. He was a warrior, a king. The thought came from nowhere, unbidden but certain. He turned back to her. "Sit down," he commanded, though his voice was not harsh. He indicated a bedroll near the fire. She obeyed numbly, sinking onto the soft furs. The ache on her collarbone was a constant, pulsing reminder of what had happened. Tentatively, she reached up and pulled down the collar of her tunic. In the firelight, she saw it, a mark etched into her skin as if with silver ink. It was a perfect, delicate crescent moon, and nestled within its curve was a single, tiny star. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. A brand. He had branded her. "What is this?" she whispered, her fingers tracing the impossible design. It did not feel like a wound. The skin was smooth, unblemished, yet the mark was undeniably there. Kaelin came to kneel before her, his large frame crowding the small space. He did not touch the mark, but his golden eyes were fixed on it. "It is the bond," he said, his voice low and reverent. "The soul bond. It manifests when fated mates first touch." Fated mates? The words were from old stories, tales told to children about the founding of the great packs, about how the first alphas found their lunas. She had thought they were just that, stories. "No," she said, shaking her head in denial. "That's not possible. I'm an Omega. I'm nothing." His expression hardened at her words. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so primal it made the hairs on her arms stand up. "You are not nothing," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You are the other half of my soul. I have searched for you for centuries." Centuries. The word hung in the air between them. He was ancient. This terrifyingly beautiful man was ancient. It was too much. Her world had tilted on its axis and spun out of control. Despair, confusion, and a terrifying, fragile flicker of hope warred within her. She looked at him, at the raw certainty in his glowing eyes, and a part of her wanted to believe him. A part of her wanted to drown in the warmth of his presence, to accept this insane reality where she was not worthless, but cherished. But years of abuse had built high walls around her heart. "You're wrong," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You've made a mistake." "I have made many mistakes in my long life," Kaelin said, his voice softening again. He reached out and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You are not one of them." His touch did not burn this time. It sent a cascade of warmth through her, a soothing balm on her fractured spirit. Tears she had refused to shed for Lyra now welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing hot paths down her cold skin. She was not crying from pain or sadness, but from a profound, shattering confusion. What was happening to her? He did not say anything more. He simply held her, letting her quiet sobs shake her frame, his presence a solid, unshakable anchor in the storm of her emotions. For the first time in her life, someone was holding her as if she were precious, and it terrified her more than any blow ever had. Unseen, unheard, a figure detached from the cliff face far above, Lyra had followed her. She had wanted to watch. She had wanted to see the worthless Omega finally break, to see her final, pathetic act of desperation. She had watched Alara step into the void. A vicious smile had touched her lips. But then the winged man had appeared, the Alpha King, Kaelin. Even from a distance, his power was a palpable force, a pressure in the air. Lyra had watched in stunned disbelief as he caught Alara, as he held her. She had seen the flash of light, even through the swirling snow. A bond. He had bonded with that thing. Rage, cold and sharp, replaced her shock. The king, the most powerful alpha in the world, had claimed the Omega filth she had tormented for years. It was impossible. It was an insult. Alara was meant to be nothing, to die as nothing. She was not meant to be chosen. Lyra scrambled back from the edge, her mind racing. Her father, Alpha Valerius, was ambitious. He had made secret pacts, whispered alliances with powers that sought to undermine the old king's rule. He was part of the Ember Covenant, a shadowy faction led by a being they called Morwin. They believed Kaelin was a relic, his time over. And Lyra had just seen his one weakness. She ran, heedless of the storm, fueled by a venomous jealousy. She had to tell her father. The Omega was not a worthless piece of trash anymore. She was a key, a weapon to be used against the Alpha King. Ilara had tried to throw her life away, but Lyra would ensure it was taken for a far greater purpose. Back in the cave, the storm outside raged on, but inside, a fragile quiet had fallen. Ilara had cried herself into an exhausted stillness, still wrapped in Kaelin's cloak, her body slumped against a bedroll. Kaelin watched her, his expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and a deep, aching tenderness. He had waited so long, the loneliness of his long life a constant gnawing ache. And now here she was, broken, terrified, but she was here. She was real. He saw the fading bruise on her cheek, the raw, chapped skin of her hands, the gauntness of her frame. A cold, lethal fury settled in his heart. Someone had hurt her. Someone had made his mate feel so worthless she had sought to end her own life. He would find who was responsible, and he would erase them from the world. But first, he had to care for her. He had to get her away from here, away from whatever darkness had driven her to this. He needed to take her home, to the Silver Citadel, where she would be safe, where she would be queen. "You need to rest," he said softly, his voice pulling her from her daze. "I must secure our passage. The storm is too severe for flight, even for me. I will be back before sunrise." Panic seized her. "Don't leave me," she pleaded, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The thought of being alone again was suddenly unbearable. He knelt before her again, taking her hand in his. His was huge, completely enveloping hers, but his touch was gentle. "I will not be long. No one knows we are here. You will be safe. I promise." He squeezed her hand, and the warmth from his skin seemed to travel up her arm, settling directly in her chest. A reassurance that went deeper than words. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He released her hand, stood, and with one last lingering look, he disappeared into the narrow passage, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the overwhelming reality of her new life. She was not alone for long. The quiet was shattered by the grating sound of stone from the cave entrance. It was not Kaelin. The feeling was wrong. A cold dread washed over her. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the heavy cloak around her like armor. 3 figures stepped out of the passage, their forms silhouetted against the dim light. They were large, broad-shouldered shifters from her pack, their faces grim. They moved with a predatory silence that made her blood run cold. "The Alpha wants to see you, Omega," one of them growled. His eyes flickered to the mark on her collarbone, which she had forgotten to cover again. A flicker of greedy understanding crossed his face. Fear gave way to a desperate, wild panic. Kaelin's promise echoed in her mind. "You will be safe." He was wrong. She backed away, her eyes darting around the small cave. There was nowhere to run. "Stay away from me," she warned, her voice trembling but with a surprising edge of command she did not know she possessed. The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who's going to stop us? Your new pet?" He lunged. Ilara reacted on pure instinct. She threw up her hands to ward him off. She expected to be grabbed, to be overpowered. She did not expect the faint shimmer of light that pulsed from her palms. The shifter grunted in surprise as he was knocked back a step, as if he had run into an invisible wall. It was only a flicker, a brief spark of the power that had been awakened in her. It was not enough. Before she could react again, the other two were on her. They grabbed her arms, their grips bruising. The first man recovered, his face twisted in a snarl. He produced a set of chains from his belt. They were not iron. They were a dull, sickly silver. The moment the cold metal touched her skin, a new kind of agony ripped through her. It was a vile, parasitic cold that did not just chill her body, but her very soul. The warm, thrumming connection to Kaelin, the bond, was instantly muffled, choked. It felt like a vital part of her was being suffocated. She screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony, and then the world went black. She awoke to darkness and a bone-deep chill. She was lying on a stone floor, the damp cold seeping through her clothes. The silver chains were wrapped around her wrists and ankles, and each point of contact was a source of numbing, agonizing cold. The bond was a faint, distant pulse, a barely there echo that was painful in its absence. It felt like she was dying from the inside out. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her body aching. She was in a small, windowless cell. A single torch sputtered in a bracket on the wall, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was stale, smelling of mildew and despair. The door creaked open, and a figure entered. He was tall and unnaturally thin, wrapped in robes the color of ash. His face was hidden in the deep shadow of his hood, but she could feel the power rolling off him, a cloying, oppressive darkness that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. It was a perversion of the power she felt from Kaelin. Where Kaelin was a winter storm, this man was a stagnant, suffocating tomb. "The king's mate," the figure said, his voice a dry, sibilant whisper. It scraped along her nerves. So this is what he has been waiting for. A frightened little mouse. Alara pressed herself back against the cold stone wall, the silver chains clinking. "Who are you?" The man laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I am the future. I am the one who will correct the stagnation of the past. You may call me Morwin." He stepped closer, and for a moment, the torchlight illuminated his face. It was pale and gaunt, with eyes that were black pits, devoid of any light or warmth. He was the leader of the Ember Covenant, the Shadow King. "What do you want with me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Want?" Morwin tilted his head. "You misunderstand your role. You are not a person to be wanted. You are a tool, a key. The bond you share with Kaelin, the so-called soul bond, is a conduit of immense power, a power I intend to take for myself." The cold in her veins deepened. "You can't." "Oh, but I can," he whispered, circling her cell like a vulture. "We have prepared a ritual. It will sever the bond. It will be excruciating for you both, of course. Imagine your soul being torn in half. The power released in that moment will be magnificent. And I will be there to claim it. With that power, I will finally be able to challenge the old king and take his throne." He paused, his dark eyes fixing on her. "Your alpha, Valerius, was most helpful. He saw your potential as a bargaining chip the moment his daughter reported back. He delivered you to me without a second thought. Betrayal was a bitter pill on top of the fear and pain. Of course. Valerius had sold her. She was worthless to him until she was worth something to his master." "Kaelin will find me," she said, the words a desperate prayer. "I am counting on it," Morwin said with chilling confidence. "Your pain will be a beacon to him. He will come charging in, blinded by rage and love. He will walk directly into my trap, and you, my dear, will be the bait. He turned and swept from the cell, the door booming shut behind him, plunging her back into near darkness. She was alone with his terrifying words and the agonizing, muffled silence where the vibrant song of her bond used to be. Despair, deeper and colder than anything she had felt on the cliff, consumed her. She had been given a glimpse of hope, a moment of impossible warmth, only to have it ripped away. She slumped against the wall, the silver chain stealing her strength, her will. Morwin was right. She was just a tool, a trap. Her existence would lead to the death of the one person who had ever shown her kindness. The guilt was a crushing weight. Hours, or perhaps days, passed in that cold, dark cell. She lost track of time. They brought her stale bread and water, but she could not eat. The pain of the suppressed bond was a constant, gnawing agony. It was a spiritual amputation. At her lowest point, when the last vestiges of hope had faded, she closed her eyes and focused inward. She searched for the faint, flickering pulse of the bond. It was so weak, so distant. She poured all of her will, all of her remaining energy into that one fragile connection. She reached for him across the void. Kaelin. She did not say the name aloud. She thought it, screamed it into the emptiness of her soul. Kaelin, I'm sorry. Please, don't come for me. It's a trap. And then, a response. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A surge of warmth, of incredible, unshakable strength, cutting through the suffocating cold of the silver. His voice echoed, not in her ears, but directly in her mind, clear and powerful. Hold on. The two words were a lifeline. They were a promise, a command. I'm coming. Tears of relief streamed down her face. He had heard her. The bond was not broken. It was damaged, suppressed, but it was not broken. He was coming. And for the first time since her capture, she felt not despair, but a fierce, burning resolve. She would not be a tool. She would not be the bait in a trap. She would hold on. The ritual began in a vast, cavernous hall. Lyra was dragged from her cell and chained to a stone altar at the center of the room. The silver chains were gone, replaced by iron ones that did nothing to stop the sudden, glorious flood of the bond returning. It rushed back into her, a tidal wave of warmth and presence and Kaelin's fierce, protective love. The pain of its absence was replaced by the joy of its return, even in these dire circumstances. Morwin stood before the altar, his followers, the robed members of the Ember Covenant, forming a circle around them. They began to chant, their voices weaving a dark, discordant melody that made the air crackle with malevolent energy. Black smoke began to rise from runes carved into the floor, coalescing around the altar. He is close, Morwin hissed, his black eyes gleaming with anticipation. He can feel your terror. He cannot resist. Lyra felt it too. Through the bond, she could feel Kaelin's rage, a force of nature, a blizzard of righteous fury descending upon this place. He was not walking into a trap. He was the storm that would tear it apart. Just as the dark energy began to snake around her legs, a sound like a thunderclap shook the entire fortress. One of the massive stone walls of the cavern exploded inward, showering the chamber in rock and dust. Through the breach, he appeared. Kaelin. His wings were spread wide, his silver hair a wild halo, and his eyes were not gold, but a burning, incandescent silver. He was no longer a king. He was a god of winter's wrath. Behind him poured his winter guard, elite warriors in white fur and gleaming steel, their howls of rage joining their king's. The battle was immediate and brutal. Kaelin's guards crashed into the Ember Covenant, steel meeting steel, the sounds of battle echoing through the vast chamber. But Kaelin himself moved like a blur, a whirlwind of destruction aimed directly at the altar. Shadow creatures, summoned by the Covenant's chanting, rose to meet him, but he tore through them like they were made of smoke. Morwin watched his approach, a confident smirk on his pale face. "As I predicted," he whispered, raising his hands. A shield of pure darkness shimmered into existence around the altar, blocking Kaelin's path. The Alpha King slammed into it, and the entire cavern groaned under the impact of his power against the dark magic. "You cannot have her, old wolf," Morwin taunted, his voice rising above the din. "Her power, your power, it will all be mine." He began to chant, and the dark energy around Lyra intensified, sinking its tendrils into her, trying to find the bond and rip it out. The pain was excruciating, 1,000 times worse than the silver chains. She screamed. Her scream cut through the noise of the battle. Kaelin heard it. His rage became something cold, something focused and utterly lethal. He drew back and struck the shield again, not with brute force, but with a concentrated blast of pure alpha power. The dark shield fractured, then shattered like black glass. Kaelin and Morwin met in the center of the room. It was a clash of titans, light against dark, ancient power against forbidden magic. Kaelin was stronger, faster, but Morwin's magic was insidious. He threw bolts of shadow that sizzled where they struck, and summoned grasping tendrils of darkness from the floor. Lyra could only watch, chained to the altar, her heart in her throat. She saw Kaelin falter. A tendril of shadow, sharp as a spear, had slipped past his guard and pierced his side. He roared in pain, stumbling to one knee. The silver light in his eyes flickered. Seeing him hurt, seeing him in danger because of her, something inside Lyra broke. The fear, the pain, the years of being told she was worthless, it all coalesced into a single, explosive point of pure, untamed rage. It was not her rage. It was the rage of a mate defending her own. A wave of brilliant, pure white light erupted from her. It was not hot like the forging of the bond. It was a pure, cleansing energy. It blasted outward in a silent, perfect sphere. The iron chains holding her to the altar did not just break. They dissolved into dust. The shadow creatures vaporized. The chanting Ember Covenant members were thrown back, their dark magic extinguished. The entire cavern was filled with her light. Morwin, who had been advancing on the wounded Kaelin, was staggered, crying out as the light seared his shadowy form. He turned, his black eyes wide with disbelief and fury, and stared at Lyra. She was no longer chained to the altar. She was floating a few inches above it, her simple tunic glowing as if woven from starlight, her hair lifted by an unseen wind. The mark on her collarbone pulsed with a light so bright it was painful to look at. "You," he snarled, his voice shaking. "A worthless Omega. You are nothing." Lyra looked at him, her eyes now glowing with the same soft white light that surrounded her. The self-doubt, the fear, the feeling of worthlessness, it was all gone, burned away by the fire of her unleashed power. She felt the bond, strong and clear, and in it, she felt Kaelin's pain, his pride, his overwhelming love. She raised her hand, her movements graceful and certain. "I am not nothing," she said, her voice clear and resonant, filled with a power she had never known. I am his. She looked toward Kaelin, who was watching her with stunned, reverent awe. And he is mine. She turned her gaze back to Morwin. She focused all of her power, all of her light, into a single, focused beam, and unleashed it. It struck the Shadow King square in the chest. He did not even have time to scream. He simply dissolved, his dark form unraveling like smoke in the wind, until nothing was left but a pile of ash on the stone floor. The light receded, leaving the chamber in a sudden, ringing silence. The remaining Covenant members, their master gone, broke and fled. Alara's feet touched the ground, her strength leaving her in a sudden rush. The world tilted and she swayed. Before she could fall, Kaelin was there. He swept her into his arms, ignoring his own wound. He held her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair. He was trembling. Lyra. He breathed her name like a prayer. He pulled back, his hands cupping her face. His eyes were molten gold again, filled with an impossible mix of awe, relief, and a love so profound it stole her breath. Your power. You are magnificent. You were hurt, she whispered, her hand going to the wound in his side. A faint warmth spread from her fingertips, and she watched in amazement as the dark, gaping wound knitted itself closed, leaving only torn fabric and unblemished skin behind. She was a healer. Her power was life. He captured her hand and pressed it to his lips. You saved me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You caught me when I fell, she replied, her voice soft. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. She looked at him, this ancient, powerful king who had seen her at her lowest and called her magnificent. She reached up, her fingers tracing the silver mark on her collarbone. Then, with a certainty that came from the deepest part of her soul, she pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. She was not just accepting the bond. She was claiming him in return. A blinding light, gold and silver, enveloped them both. Her mark blazed with silver fire. On his chest, beneath her hand, a new mark burned itself into existence. A golden sun, brilliant and radiant, a perfect counterpart to her crescent moon. The bond was complete. It was a bridge of light and power and love, flowing not just from him to her, but from her to him. A circuit of two souls made whole. They returned to his home, the Silver Citadel, a breathtaking city of white towers and crystal bridges nestled in the heart of the mountains. Kaelin did not hide her away. The moment they arrived, he gathered his people, thousands of shifters, warriors, and families in the great plaza. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. His touch was warm, solid, real. "Welcome home," he murmured, for her ears only. She squeezed his hand, a real smile, bright and true, finally reaching her eyes. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer worthless. She was a Lyra, mate of the Alpha King. She was a healer, a light bringer. She was a queen. And she was, finally and truly, home.